and thank you for joining us. Welcome, and thank you for joining us for today's National Conference of State Legislatures webinar, American Rescue Plan, Addressing Youth and Young Adult Homelessness and Economic Insecurity. Before we get started, let's get a sense of where all of you are joining us from today. If you would, navigate to the bottom of your screen. You should see a ribbon pop up and you'll find the chat box there. Click that box and type in where you're joining us from. Excellent. I'm seeing some responses coming in. We've got folks from Georgia, Phoenix, Arizona, Washington State, Kansas, Connecticut, Alaska. Excellent. Wonderful. We've got some folks from Kansas, some other folks from Connecticut, Iowa, Kentucky. So again, if you're just joining us, type in where you're joining us from across the country. All right, I'm seeing the chat slowing down a little bit. I'm hoping that all of you are joining us here today. As you can see, many of your colleagues are joining from all across the country. My name is Heather Hanna. I'm a program director with the Children and Families program here at NCSL, and I'll be your moderator for today. Over the next 60 minutes, we'll explore the intersection of the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021, youth and young adult homelessness, and education. This session will highlight the unique opportunity to address the immediate needs of youth and young adults, while also making long-term systemic changes with limited time funds. Throughout the webinar, please feel free to use that chat box that you found earlier on, and you can communicate with us if you're having any issues or have any particular questions. If you have a question for our panelists, please use the Q&A button. Again, you can find that in that ribbon at the bottom of your screen, and you can type in your questions there. We'll host a moderated Q&A with our experts later in the webinar. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available on NCSL's website. And we will also post a slide deck of today's presentation and speaker biographies there as well. During our time together, we're going to discuss a wealth of data and resources, all of which will be included in a resource guide that we'll share with you later in the webinar. So with that, before we introduce our experts, I thought it would be good to just briefly discuss some of the key statistics and issues related to youth and young adults experiencing homelessness, and some of the legislative action that states have taken to help. According to a national study by Chapin Hall at the University of Chicago, 4.2 million youth and young adults experienced homelessness on their own during a 12-month period. This includes 3.5 million young adults between the ages of 18 to 25. Chapin Hall's study also found that 29% of adults who experienced homelessness were enrolled in college or another educational program at the time that they experienced homelessness. As you can imagine, there are many risk factors associated with youth homelessness. In a 2019 report by the Congressional Research Service, they identified family conflict, sexual orientation, sexual activity, school problems, pregnancy, and substance use as primary risk factors for youth homelessness. Children in foster care also face multiple factors that increase their risk of homelessness, including the number of placements, foster care placements, a history of running away from those placements, and time spent in a group home. If you're interested in additional information, please visit NCSL's Youth Homelessness Overview. Many states have enacted legislation to support youth and young adults experiencing homelessness. In just the last year, 73 bills have been enacted in 24 states just on the topic of housing and homelessness. Of those bills, 8 in 7 states have focused specifically on youth homelessness. Notable legislation has included allowing higher education institutions to designate a homeless and foster students liaison, allowing unaccompanied homeless minors to access healthcare without parental consent, and allowing unaccompanied homeless minors to access their vital records, such as their birth certificate. If you'd like to take a deeper dive into housing and homelessness legislation, please visit NCSL's Housing and Homelessness Database. There you can search current and previous legislation on a variety of topics impacting youth and young adults experiencing homelessness. In March, the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021 was passed by Congress and signed into law by President Joe Biden. The American Rescue Plan offers an opportunity to support recovery from the economic and health impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. This historic opportunity provides $800 million in funding for children and youth experiencing homelessness. The American Rescue Plan also provides a temporary increase in eligibility for the Earned Income Tax Credit with expanded benefits, particularly for those individuals without children or non-custodial parents. For students attending school at least part-time, the age limit is reduced from 25 to 24. And for former foster youth and youth who are experiencing homelessness, the minimum age is reduced from 25 to 18. These changes are temporary and only for the 2021 tax year. The American Rescue Plan also provides temporary expanded benefits for the child tax credit. Families with children may be eligible to receive a tax credit of up to $3,600 for each child ages birth through 5, and up to $3,000 for each child ages 6 through 17. Families may also elect to receive advance payment beginning July 1 through December 31st of 2021. Again, these changes are temporary and only for the 2021 tax year. Together, these relief efforts provide direct and immediate supports for youth and young adults experiencing homelessness. And at the end of the webinar, we'll provide additional information on these economic relief supports. So the issue of student debt is also related to youth and young adults homelessness. As mentioned just a few slides ago, 29% of young adults who experienced homelessness were enrolled in college or another educational program. And today, more than 44 million Americans owe a balance on a student loan, with the average borrower owing more than $25,000. Over time, student debt can impact an individual's credit score, ability to gain homeownership, and to save for retirement. The American Rescue Plan includes provisions related to student debt, including federal student loan payments are deferred, interest is waived, and collection actions, penalties, and fees are suspended through September 30th, 2021. It's important to note that 92% of all student loans are federal student loans. It also provides tax-free status for student loan forgiveness and student loan calculation through December 31st, 2025. State legislatures have also taken up the issue of student debt. Approximately half of student loan related bills that were introduced in state legislatures during the last year have focused on forgiveness or repayment of student loans. And again, NCSL has many resources on student debt, including a recent article in state legislatures news. So with that, now that you have additional context and background, we are excited to have with us today two experts to help deepen our knowledge and understanding on the issues related to youth and young adults experiencing homelessness, and offer some opportunities to consider using the funds related to the American Rescue Plan. First up, we have Patricia Julianelle, the Senior Strategist for Program Advancement and Legal Affairs with Schoolhouse Connection. We'll then hear from Joseph Bishop, the Director of the Center for the Transformation of Schools with the School of Education and Information Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles. Biographies on each speaker are available in the chat. And with that, please join me in welcoming Patricia and Joe.
Thanks, Heather. It's very nice to be here today. Thank you for everyone who's taken the time to join us. My name is Patricia Julianelle, and I work with Schoolhouse Connection. We can hop right to the next slide, and I'll tell you a little bit about Schoolhouse Connection in case you're not familiar with us. We are a national nonprofit organization working to overcome homelessness through education. You have there on our slide a link to our website. We also do have state policy resources. Some of them are very similar to the great resources that NCSL offers, but you can visit our page there to find out about what some state legislatures around the country have been working on related to youth homelessness. And you can also get information about our state policy community of practice, which meets just about every 2 months and again provides information and support around state legislative issues related to youth homelessness. What I want to share with you today is just a pretty brief overview of some of the federal resources available for youth and young adults, particularly in the education sphere. Heather talked a lot about the various risk factors affecting youth homelessness, and one of the studies that she cited, the largest study done on unaccompanied youth and young adult homelessness in the United States, found that the greatest single risk factor for young adult homelessness is the lack of a high school degree. So we feel like the connection between youth homelessness and education is research-based, and it's really an important intervention point to try to break the cycle of homelessness and prevent youth and young adult homelessness. So I want to talk about a few of the programs that are here on this slide. And let's start with the McKinney-Vento Act. Some of you, I expect, are quite familiar with this, others maybe less so. The McKinney-Vento Act is a federal law that covers a lot of different aspects of homeless policy in the US. We can jump to, I think, probably 2 slides up. But the part I want to talk about is the piece of the McKinney-Vento Act that provides educational rights to children and youth experiencing homelessness. And as you might imagine, from a practical standpoint, if you don't have a stable address, it can be very difficult to enroll in school, from the very basics of how do you provide proof of residency to more complicated issues like if you're moving around constantly, where do you go to school? So the McKinney-Vento Act addresses some of those very basic questions, and it also puts a larger structure in place to provide services and support to students experiencing homelessness. I won't go over everything that the law provides right now, but I do want to make sure that everyone on the call knows that every state has a state coordinator for homeless education who is in charge of implementing this federal law in that state and helping to make sure students experiencing homelessness get what they need. There's a link on the slide where you can find the contact information for all of the state coordinators. So if you would like more information about what's going on in your state, you can reach out to that office at your state educational agency. And also every local educational agency, so that would include your school districts and also charter schools, they have a local liaison who is kind of like the state coordinator, but at the local level. So you can also find out what's going on in your particular legislative district by reaching out to your school districts or charter schools and saying, hey, I'd like to talk to the local homeless liaison and find out what the needs are and what's happening in my community. One thing that I do want to make sure you know about the McKinney-Vento Act, because it is different from other laws and it's really important, is how homelessness is defined. Because a lot of people have an image of, someone who might be on the street asking for money or staying in a shelter. And those situations certainly are included. But the McKinney-Vento Act also recognizes families and youth who have to leave with where they are staying because they've been evicted. Maybe they lost a job. Maybe they had a healthcare crisis. They can no longer stay where they're staying. And they don't have anywhere to go, and they can't afford to just get a new apartment or get another place. So they end up staying temporarily, sometimes with friends, sometimes with family. Unfortunately, for many of our youth, they end up staying with perfect strangers in situations that are trafficking, sex trafficking or labor trafficking. And those kind of shared housing arrangements are considered homeless. So that's not the same as a roommate or someone who's just renting a room in a house. But those are people who have lost their housing and are staying temporarily with others. In the most recent count that we have nationally, our public schools identified 1.4 million students experiencing homelessness. So just to give you an idea of the scale of that, and the prevalence of homelessness is the same in rural and urban areas. So that really is truly nationally an issue that we're seeing everywhere. So I want to talk to you also about some of those federal funds that Heather mentioned that have just come out recently that are somewhat time limited. First one is ESSER, the Elementary and Secondary School Education Relief Funding Source. Those funds are going out to local educational agencies and states as well. In terms of homelessness in particular, there is a requirement that 20% of those funds at the local level are set aside to address a number of concerns around learning loss and academic and mental health needs, particularly of students who have been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic, and that includes students experiencing homelessness. So those funding sources are available and really need to be used at the local level for some of these populations like youth experiencing homelessness, recognizing that the pandemic in many ways has been harder on them than it has been on others. There's also an allowable use of funding to address the unique needs of students experiencing homelessness. Our students, of course, are affected by economic problems and health problems, as all students are, but they have unique needs that are related to things like trauma, mental health needs. They often lack transportation. They often lack connectivity, technology. They often lack any kind of a supportive adult to help them with school and with their learning. So these are special needs that ESSER funds are available to be used for. So the last kind of pot of funds I want to talk to you about are these ARP Homeless Children and Youth Funds. As Heather mentioned, that's $800 million in funding specifically for students experiencing homelessness. The ARP HCY funds were a bipartisan amendment sponsored by Senator Murkowski and Senator Manchin. We called them M&M when we had our meetings with their staffers. And this really earmarked specifically $800 million only to serve the needs of children and youth experiencing homelessness. So some of those funds, about 200 million, have actually gone out to states already. Those are being awarded to local communities on a competitive basis. So again, you could reach out to your state coordinator and ask them, how are these funds going out? Have funds come to my local community, to my legislative district? How are those being allocated for my community? The larger pot of the funds, 600 million, will actually be going out perhaps later this summer. I think it's much more likely that those will actually go out in the fall. And those will be going to local communities by a formula. So again, you can find out from your state coordinator, when are those funds going out? How will they be going out? I'll be honest with you that your state won't know too much already, because the Department of Education at the federal level hasn't given out too much guidance yet. So you might want to wait a couple of months before you call the state, but you certainly could ask them, how much will my local community be getting in those funds? In terms of just a few other details, I'm going to go over the next few slides very quickly, just in the interest of time. But as I said, those are going out in 2 batches. We can just kind of keep going through the next few slides quickly. Let's move on to the next slide, if you don't mind. These ARP funds are designed to meet urgent needs. So the idea here is that the funds go out to your communities quickly so that they can be used quickly, recognizing that schools are in the midst of trying to recover from the pandemic right now. So they need the funding support right now. However, it is important to know that the time to spend down these funds actually is a longer time period. So even though there's this idea that we want to meet urgent needs, the spend down period actually goes all the way through 2025. So I know a lot of local communities are really scrambling, thinking, oh my gosh, we have all this money, we have to spend it really quickly. How are we going to do it? And it's important, I think, for your local communities to know that they can take some time. They can do some planning, they can do some assessments of needs, and they can think about what is really going to be the best use of this funding to have the most impact on students experiencing homelessness, not only immediately, but also in the longer term. The other thing I wanted to mention is that these ARP Homeless Children and Youth Funds, $800 million is a lot of money for the Homeless Children and Youth Program, and we're very happy about it. But of course, it pales in comparison to some of the other funding sources that are available. So the idea is that the HCY funds, if you want to put it in an image, are the sprinkles that are on top of the frosting that's on top of the cake. And our youth experiencing homelessness need everything. They get the whole cake. So these funds are meant to supplement supports that are going to be put into place through the ESSER funds, through other federal education funding, as well as other state and local education funding. So we're really looking at what are the particular and unique needs of children and youth experiencing homelessness, and how can we use these funds to meet those needs, while other funds are meeting more generic needs around academic support, mental health, et cetera. So we do have some guidance from the U.S. Department of Education. There's a link there where you can get more information if you're interested. The allowable uses of these sprinkles funds are very, very broad. Your local school districts and your state Department of Ed are probably not used to having so much flexibility in using education funds. There was really a lot of emphasis in let's give money to schools and let them use it how they need to use it. They know what their students need. Let's try to provide as much flexibility as possible. So it really is an opportunity for communities to really think about what are the needs that maybe we've always had and never been able to meet, and what are the new needs that might be related to the pandemic, and how can we think strategically and use these dollars in a way to really make a difference to our schools and to our students over the longer haul. So let's go forward. There is the allowability here in these homeless children and youth funds for community partnerships. So school districts are encouraged to award contracts and grants to community agencies, particularly those that are well positioned to work with historically underserved populations. So looking at your pregnant and parenting students, looking at your students of color, those with disabilities, LGBTQ+ students, and a real focus on rural areas as well. So one area of particular interest is we wanted to let you know that there are a lot of other ARP funds out there besides just these education funds. There are funds for early learning, higher education, lots and lots of funds for housing and rental assistance. So we don't want schools to think that they need to be in the position of solving all the world's problems. But one thing that they might be able to do with their homeless children and youth money is hire a navigator to help connect parents and families to some of these other resources that are out there. And another issue that we wanted to, I'm sorry, I've got a dog barking here. You can jump ahead to the next slide, please. In terms of some of the considerations for using funds strategically, remember to use all of those ARP funds that I just mentioned. Make sure that your schools are aware of what's available and that families and, youth can access all of the different variety of funds. Those income tax credits that Heather was talking about, the child care credits, and the other funds that are available. Let's go ahead and bounce forward if you don't mind. I want to get to the poll and allow some input from you all. So the last issue that I wanted to address is the specific challenges of minors who are unaccompanied homeless youth. So we have about 750,000 unaccompanied homeless youth who are teenagers under the age of 18. So they're experiencing homelessness without a parent or guardian. They have very high incidences of victimization and vulnerability. But because of their age, typically they can't really access the services they need. They would need a parent or guardian to help them access those services, and they don't have that parent or guardian for a variety of reasons. So I'd like to kind of get a feel for you all about what kinds of services minors experiencing homelessness on their own can access without a parent or guardian in your state. And you might not know the answer to this question. A lot of people don't. It's kind of a very specialized question, so that's perfectly fine. But if you do know if youth under 18 can access services without a parent, go ahead and check the box, and you can check as many boxes here that apply. We'll give you a couple of seconds to get your votes in. Okay, well, this is great that many of you actually did have information about this at the tips of your fingers. About a third of you said that unaccompanied youth under 18 can access healthcare. This, of course, is especially important with the pandemic. About the same for behavioral healthcare, whether that be mental health or substance abuse. More than half of you said that youth under 18 can access shelter and related services on their own, which is really surprising because in my research on state law, that's usually a minority of states. And then as well as very few can sign a lease. Accessing documents was also very few, and lots of you who aren't aware, which is fine. And we'll give you some information later about where you can find more information about what's happening in your state. But I do want to let you know that there are laws in place in lots of states around the country that do allow unaccompanied youth under 18 to access these services. So these are just two examples. There are many, many other examples in many, many other states, but we just wanted to pull out a couple to give you an idea. There's a bill that just passed this year in North Dakota to allow unaccompanied homeless youth age 14 and older to consent for certain routine health care on their own behalf. That allows them to do things like get COVID vaccines, for example, as well as access counseling if they'd like, or, you know, if they have pink eye, they have a stomach ache. There's lots of health problems that are very, very common among our homeless youth. And it's really critical for them to be able to access care for those. And then an example from Maryland of a state law that passed last year to allow unaccompanied youth under 18 there to be able to actually access a shelter. So instead of being forced to maybe find a place to stay with someone who might be victimizing them, trafficking them, they can actually go to a reputable licensed shelter and stay there and try to get connected to additional services that way. So those were some of the pieces of information we wanted to make sure that you had as you're thinking about your own roles as state legislators and how you can impact the use of these funds in your states and your community. It really is an unprecedented moment in terms of fiscal resources for our youth experiencing homelessness. So the time now is to have bold leadership and come up with some really great ideas for how to use these funds to help our students.
Thanks, Patricia. Good morning and good afternoon, wherever you are. My name is Joe Bishop, and I direct the Center for the Transformation of Schools at UCLA. And I want to thank Heather Hanna and the team at NCSL, including Riley Sawyer, for hosting us today. This is such an important conversation. And I also want to acknowledge Schoolhouse Connection. Without their advocacy at the federal level, there would not be this focus on homeless education, students experiencing homelessness in our country, especially as part of the American Rescue Plan. So although Patricia won't say it, they've been instrumental. So we have a really important opportunity here, going back to the previous slide, just to think about, how do we rethink policies broadly at the local, the state, and the federal level to support students experiencing homelessness. Because based on our research, and it's good to see colleagues from the Rakes Foundation who supported that work, we really are in a state of crisis, not only in California, but across our country. The youth homelessness crisis is impacting every community, and COVID has made that even more pronounced. So as Patricia said, we need bold leadership now, and we need new policy champions. So thank you for being on. And going to the next slide, thanks, Riley. The goals in 10 minutes, we're going to accomplish a lot, first of all, but I want to make sure that you have a better understanding of the landscape of students experiencing homelessness in the United States. We're going to dig into, now that we have a lot of resources coming down the pike, how do we rely on a strong evidence base to use those resources to support young people and families? And then last but not least, we're going to get into an exercise really around inquiry-based policy making. So it's not always about having the right answers, but the right questions to ask. And I'm going to provide you with a set of questions that you can go back to your state with to help really act as guideposts for your work as you move forward. Next slide, please, Riley. So we're polling you today. If only polls were this easy in real life, huh? So how involved are you with the issue of youth homelessness in your state? And we're going to take a few minutes here to let you respond to that. Starting from not involved at all, somewhat involved, are you thinking about policies, or you've developed policies? Again, how involved are you with the issue of youth homelessness in your state? This is not a trick question. We're just trying to gauge interests and current work. We'll take another, say, 20, 30 seconds to do this. Okay, so let's look at the results here. It looks like many of you are thinking about policies or exploring possibilities. A smaller fraction of you, approximately 1 in 5, have developed policies. Someone involved, and some of you are also. It's a great mix. So, in terms of a spectrum of interest, so that's great. That's good to know for the NTSL staff moving forward. Thank you so much. Let's go to the next slide. So, as we look at students experiencing homelessness in the K-12 space, I want to talk about higher education as well. But we've seen a 48% increase in students experiencing homelessness across the United States. You know, this varies depending on the state. These numbers, the 1.4 million number that Patricia highlighted earlier, is likely much higher due to a lack of, and based on our research, a lack of liaisons and staff to identify students experiencing homelessness, and even questions about definitions and a lack of clarity around the McKinneyVento definition that Patricia talked about, or the housing urban development definition, and even state interpretations of federal law. So just keep in mind the 1.4 million number pre-COVID is really more of an estimate. We believe, I think most researchers believe, that that number is actually much higher. And after COVID, we're expecting the number to unfortunately increase, especially for unaccompanied youth, as Patricia just highlighted previously. Next slide, please. And as we look at higher education and college going rates across the United States, so we've seen a slight decrease across the country. Again, it varies within states. This is not always the case, but as a whole, fewer students are attending college. But then when we go to the next slide, we are seeing a slight decrease as we look at national data for young people, college-age students who are experiencing homelessness. Now, just keep in mind, this does not reflect students who are housing insecure. This is an imperfect way of tracking data. We don't have great data at the national level to really monitor trends for college going, for college-age youth who are housing insecure, but in general, we're seeing a slight decrease at the college level. Next slide, please. And as we shift now to the research, so we talked about the $800 million for homeless ed, and as a package, $1.4 trillion, where we could prioritize the success, the health, the well-being of young people experiencing homelessness. Matt Morton and the folks at the University of Chicago, you've heard Chicago a lot, University of Chicago, looked at 4,000 studies around effective interventions and strategies for young people experiencing homelessness. And what they found, I just want to highlight a few. What they found in their scan of 4,000 studies, I want to talk about three key themes here. One, they found that prevention efforts and individualized, intensive counseling and casework tends to have the greatest impact on young people. That high touch, intensive focus can yield the greatest impact for young people. Family strengthening was also highlighted in the research. So by family strengthening, meaning connecting families to services, providing housing, finding jobs. And then the third bullet, which I'll talk about a little bit, so transitional, supportive, and subsidized housing. Housing needs change sometimes for families depending on the day, the week, or the month. So sometimes when we think about homelessness, we think of it as a permanent thing, which is why we've all been using the term students experiencing homelessness. So just to keep in mind that a transitional housing opportunity can get families back on their feet, or young people back on their feet, in a pretty powerful way. But as we look at the research, there's a lot we don't know, unfortunately, but what we do know is that there are remedies, interventions, and preventive work that can happen to support families as you think about what's the best use of funds, state funds coming from the federal government. Next slide, please. And as we take a step back, as we think about policy broadly, education policy in particular, we know that out-of-school factors actually predict 2/3 of student achievement. So out-of-school factors are more predictive than in school. And by out of school, I'm talking about neighborhood conditions, health, housing, and I'm talking about health access and specifically prenatal care. So those out-of-school factors actually shape the lives of young people profoundly, more so than in-school factors, by teacher preparation, curriculum, kind of the traditional ways that you think about policies in schools. And this is particularly true for young people experiencing homelessness. So we, as a policy kind of new vision, the American Rescue Plan is really pushing us as a country to think about how do we work with in-school and out-of-school policy simultaneously for young people, because poverty is a reality in every community and is impacting millions and millions of young people, especially housing insecure young people. Next slide, please. And as we think about whole system equity, we have to think about, again, out-of-school factors, the design of our systems, our practices, our resources, and then how do these, how can our focus ultimately get to the structural and systemic issues of our society around race, class, culture, and language? So we need that ecosystems approach as we think about solutions moving forward. Next slide, please. Thanks, Riley. So Patricia talked a little bit, and Heather as well, about state responses. So state responses to homelessness have been strong, but there's much that still can be done. They've mostly focused on removing barriers for childcare or preschool eligibility. And Schoolhouse Connection actually has a great summary of policy responses, state policy responses in particular. We've talked about consent. Patricia talked about this a little bit. If young people don't have the power or authority to get services because of state law, it's another hurdle to their health and well-being. Policies have looked at greater flexibility in time towards graduation and rapid rehousing at the college level. There's many more policy responses, but in general, I don't think anybody would disagree that we need more robust policy responses at the state level to this crisis. Next slide, please. And Patricia talked about this as well. So of the $1.4 trillion in the American Rescue Plan, the federal American Rescue Plan, there are other buckets of money that can be directed to young people and families who are housing insecure, in particular around summer enrichment, after school programs and employment benefits, home visiting models in the early years. We talked about SNAP earlier. So there's rural health and assistance transportation. So just keep in mind this 800 million, we're focusing in on more, but keep in mind as a package, the American Rescue Plan can really be leveraged by states to not only test out new models and get supplemental support, but also to build upon what your state is already doing. Next slide, please. Some of our work in California all stems around a report we did called State of Crisis: Dismantling Student Homelessness in California. More students are experiencing homelessness in California than any other state in the country. But what was clear to us is that in many of our states, even as we did a scan, state lawmakers, you may not have really a sense of the landscape of young people thinking about student achievement outcomes, school climate outcomes, college going rates for young people experiencing homelessness. So we don't have great data within our states to track, support, and prevent homelessness. So that's just something I want to highlight. And you can look up our report if you Google State of Crisis. Next slide, please. One of our big takeaways, which really applies to every state in the country, frankly, is we found that no one system can address homelessness in isolation. A coordinated multi-pronged approach is needed, involving the public and the private sector, early childhood, K-12, local government, state government, the federal government, nonprofits, community-based organizations. So we need that ecosystem response at the end of the day. Next slide, please. Also, something that we found out, which I think is a challenge, political challenge, frankly, for everybody to be thinking about, is that homelessness has been normalized in our country. And as we spoke to stakeholders in California and doing interviews, where we found that 269,000 students are experiencing homelessness, we came out with this visual of you could fill Dodger Stadium 5 times with young people experiencing homelessness, and people were shocked by that visual. But when we spoke with our state partners, it was something that wasn't, it was something that they were not surprised about it, because it's been growing for years and years. So I think a political challenge for everybody here is, how do we get our constituents to care and to act and to support you in the legislature to tackle this crisis? So I wanted to give you this visual of Dodger Stadium just as a visual reminder to you of how can you make your constituents care of an issue where they may not feel connected to or may feel intimately connected to. Next slide, please. I want to quickly go through this slide, but I think it is something that for you all to think about, is the fact that we really struggle to identify students experiencing homelessness, depending on the definition or the capacity. So as we think about a response with federal dollars, there could be more funds or people power committed to identifying young people. So it's not just homeless liaisons who shoulder the primary responsibility for identifying young people and getting them services. And that's a challenge we identified in California, which we know based on the literature is a common challenge across the country, especially for LGBTQ youth as well. Next slide, please. Something to think about that we did in California that I think can apply to other states. We looked at suspension rates, graduation rates, chronic absence rates, college readiness rates. And what we found is that young people experiencing homelessness, homeless versus non-homeless numbers are drastically different. So it's incredibly important to be able to break down or better understand state data patterns in new ways by student groups, especially for homeless and non-homeless young people. Next slide, please. So the American Rescue Plan, here's the final act, Act 3. So what do we do? What question should we be asking? Next slide, please. This was mentioned before, but it is really essential that we start working and connecting with our state agencies, state departments of ed, Department of Social Services, Department of Transportation, Department of Healthcare Services. Many of our agencies were not built in a way to support collaboration or even to develop joint plans and strategies. So the federal dollars coming down the pike and arriving already, or arrived in some instances, present a unique opportunity for you in the legislature as staff and members to start thinking about how do we get our agencies to work together in ways that they haven't worked together before, because this issue is so complicated and has so many layers to it that we have to work in new ways as agencies in ways that we've never worked before. Next slide, please. And as we think about big picture questions, here's the big picture questions to think about. One, what statewide studies? I mentioned state of crisis in California, but what studies like that for you in your state or data exists to determine the state of education and health for housing insecure youth? And what are the unique needs for students in K-12 and at the post-secondary level? And then mentioned before by Heather, what role does student debt play for college-age students? In our interviews with students, we found that homelessness is usually the result of the cumulative impact of a number of life experiences, young people losing a job, family health challenge, and the snowball effect, which also includes debt, makes it harder for students, creates another obstacle for students to be on a trajectory for health and well-being. So college student debt could play a significant role in many instances. The second question, how many students were experiencing homelessness in our state prior to COVID? For many of us, we may not have strong numbers, but getting that context is really important, especially as we plan for a post-COVID response. And how do what do we know about disconnected youth impacted by COVID? And what patterns have we seen historically by race and age? We can't ignore the role of race when we talk about homeless education and students experiencing homelessness, which are really the result of systemic and structural issues in our states and in our country. Last but not least, as we look at geography, where are students? Where are students experiencing homelessness concentrated? We found in California that depending on the county, there were different patterns. So doing a geographic analysis in addition to a racial analysis can be very illuminating for you as state policymakers. Next slide, we're almost there. What are the existing state priorities? So before we present new policies, assessing what exists. To Patricia's point, who's the McKinney-Vento State Homelessness Coordinator? Which districts or counties are receiving subgrants, McKinney-Vento subgrants? What state agencies are responsible for the health and well-being? So I gave you a list of 5 agencies. I'm guessing there are other state agencies that you could list as well. How do they collaborate? And then here's the big question for all of us to think about. Do we have statewide metrics or goals for supporting housing insecure youth? In many instances, or in most instances, states do not. But I think the American Rescue Plan presents a unique opportunity to push the envelope in that way and think about what's our vision and what are our goals for getting there. Next slide. There's a link here with a summary of my slide deck. Please access it. And yeah, there's a quick visual summary, and going to the last poll of the day, we promise. So Patricia asked a question or highlighted that there's a 20% set aside money around learning acceleration as part of the American Rescue Plan. So my question for you is really open-ended. How are you prioritizing that money to support young people experiencing homelessness specifically, of which foster youth can be part of that as well? And then why? So that's an open-ended question. And then we're going to jump to Q&A.
And you can take that poll by clicking the link in the chat box.
So again, how are you prioritizing the 20% set aside? If you don't know, that's okay. You could say that. Still trying to figure it out, or working with the board, or. I think we'll take another few seconds here. Got it. So it seems like there might be a great opportunity to work with your state board to better understand how you are planning to spend those funds, because in many instances it's a significant pot of funds. Next slide. Then, yep, there's a contact information, and Heather, take it away. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Patricia and Joe. That was a lot of information that we just went over, and we've got a couple more minutes. So what I thought we'd do is discuss a couple of key questions with our experts to help continue the conversation in your state. So we've got a couple of questions, and if you have a specific question, again, you can use that Q&A box. If we aren't able to get to all the questions that we do get, we'll post a Q&A follow-up on the NCSL website in just a week or so. So my first question, I'll start with you, Patricia. What next steps can state legislatures consider to advance this historic opportunity in their state?
Thanks, Heather. I feel like this is such an opportunity for state legislators to use their platforms as leaders. So if they are advancing legislation in the state capitol, obviously that's critically important. But I think for these these federal funds in particular, it's more about using your influence, your social media presence, your leadership presence in the community to share information about the funding that's available, the supports that are available, influence how funds are targeted. So I know I mentioned billions of new dollars for homeless services and rental assistance that's available through the Department Department of Housing and Urban Development. But a lot of those funds we're finding are not being targeted toward youth at all, because a little bit of the definitional issues that Joe mentioned. There's a different definition of homelessness depending on what agency you're working with, but youth experiencing homelessness actually are eligible for these HUD funds that have come out. So I would really encourage community leaders like state legislators to get in touch with their local community agencies that are administering some of those housing funds and find out, hey, are you serving youth with these funds? Are you serving children? If not, why not? And I'll go ahead and pop in the chat box where you can find contact information for those local agencies that are administering those federal funds. I think that would be a great way to use some influence to make sure the funding that's available is actually reaching young people.
Yeah, great ideas, Patricia. Joe, do you have anything you'd like to add on that question?
No, I think while it wasn't in the slide, as we think about questions, asking young people and meeting with young people and families what their needs are, asking first can really be illuminating and powerful. And I think sometimes we jump to looking at the policies and looking at what we're doing, but sometimes just listening and asking can be really life-changing for not only a young person, but also for you as a lawmaker or staff member. So
yeah, great point. So my next question, Joe, we'll start with you, and you both touched on this a little bit, but if you have some additional context or information that would be helpful, how can state legislators and legislative staff continue to learn more about the issue of youth and young adults experiencing homelessness and opportunities to support it?
yeah, I think starting with state-specific data and scans, and meeting with research partners, community-based partners. I mean, most states have a large infrastructure of folks who are focused on this issue, and sometimes policy takes a long time to play catch up. So I'd say ask, meet with the homeless coordinator for your state, as Patricia pointed out, and start there and see where this road takes you. And hopefully in a year, if we did this webinar again, the polling would be different, saying I feel much more familiar, or I'm ready to introduce policy, or but yeah, I'd say ask first and see what's possible.
Yeah, I would definitely echo that. Probably most legislators have in their community some organization that is serving youth experiencing homelessness. There aren't a lot of youth shelters or youth drop-in centers out there, but youth experiencing homelessness are out there. And so they're seeking help from the Boys and Girls Club, from a local health clinic, from the school system. So there are always going to be service providers in your community you could connect with, and then they could in turn connect you with the youth themselves, like Joe mentioned. I also definitely want to put in a plug for NCSL's resources. I know Heather talked about those at the top of the hour, and that website is fantastic. I would really encourage you to check that out. I'll put in the chat box our website, and I mentioned our state policy community of practice. We have our next meeting coming up on July 14th, so everyone's welcome to attend that and learn about some of the trends in state policy around youth homelessness in particular. So those are just a few ideas.
Thanks, Patricia, for the NCSL plugin. Yeah, we have a lot of resources. And as I mentioned at the start of the webinar, we'll provide you with a resource guide because we know this is a lot of information, and I think you'll find some helpful resources there. So my next question, we'll start with you this time, Joe. How do you anticipate the economic supports and student debt provisions that are related to the American Rescue Plan will impact youth and young adults experiencing homelessness? And how can state legislators continue to learn more to inform future policy?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think an immediate need is making sure that college campuses and young people know that there's allowable use of funds, and that the opportunity exists, essentially, because I think one of the challenges is there's so much coming down. So making sure that there is some public awareness is I think an immediate step, and especially working with higher ed partners and financial aid advisors to make sure they know, and that the CBOs and liaisons that Patricia mentioned are aware as well. So making sure there's this broad public awareness strategy really I think is one immediate step. But I think it could be powerful if enough people find out. But that's always my concern. That does policy get to the people who need to know?
100% agree with Joe on that. I know with the youth that we work with through our youth leadership program, so often they have no idea what they're eligible for, or they just kind of give up very easily because they don't have advocates helping them know, how do you fill out the paperwork? Where do you go? Where's the office? How do you get information? So, I think legislators and their teams have such reach through social media, through their leadership and their influence in the community, that just getting the word out on the tax credit and all of these other resources that are available would be a huge help.
Well, great. Well, unfortunately, we are just about out of time. And so if you have additional questions, again, feel free to throw those in the Q&A. We'll make sure we get to them in the follow-up. And of course, you can reach out to both of our experts or NCSL. And I'm just so appreciative that you all have joined us here today. There are many resources available to help continue this discussion in your state. As mentioned at the start of the webinar, we're going to provide you with a resource guide. You'll find that in the chat. It'll also be posted on NCSL's website, as well as in the follow-up material. So if you miss it in one place, I'm sure you'll find it in another. And again, today's webinar is being recorded, and those presentation slides that we went through will also be provided. And as our panelists and experts have shared with you, NCSL is here for you. If you need additional information or resources, please do not hesitate to reach out. So with that, I'd like to extend a final thank you to our experts. We greatly appreciate the knowledge and insight that each of you were able to provide today. And if you have additional questions for our experts, Patricia or Joe, or NCSL, please contact us. And with that, thank you so much and have a wonderful day.